Good morning and welcome to Light Reflections from First Friends. We are glad you have chosen to join us for this virtual worship service and hope you find it beneficial to your spiritual journey. We consider this an abbreviated version of our in-person meeting for worship for those wishing to join us from a distance. If this is your first time joining us, First Friends is a thriving, progressive Quaker meeting in the city of Indianapolis, Indiana. We consider ourselves a loving, inclusive, joyous gathering of people seeking to know truth under the leadership of God's Spirit. All are welcome, no matter race, age, cultural background, sexual orientation and identity, marital status, physical and mental ability, family structure, or economic circumstance. Our hope is that through this worship experience, you will discover our faith community is unlike any other, where silent meditation is as important as the spoken word, where we emphasize the importance of one's personal encounter with the divine, and where we seek to support one another as we discover truth together. Now we invite you to center down and enter this virtual worship space with us.
Hi friends, I'm Derek Snow, representing our Finance Committee. And it's that time of year when we plan for the financial needs of 2024 and start our pledge drive. Your generous contributions fund our meeting and all that it offers. Any amount that you give is very much appreciated. And we invite you to make a pledge for 2024. Your pledges are very helpful as we go through the budget process and make our financial plans for next year. In addition to pledging, and as you are able, we ask you to consider helping us close a fiscal gap for this year in 2023. To help out, you can visit this web link shown below at indyfriends.org/support. That page lists several giving options to help find the most convenient method for you. And to make an electronic pledge, you will find the Pledge Now button near the top of the page. If you prefer to have a pledge card mailed to you, please contact the office by email at office@indyfriends.org or by phone at 317-255-2485. And please submit your pledge by Sunday, December 17th. However you choose to give, your financial support of First Friends is a wonderful blessing. And thank you for being part of the First Friends family.
Be still and know that I am God. 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 Be still and know that I am God.
Good morning, friends, and welcome to Light Reflections. This morning at the Meeting House, we are having a guest speaker, so I've decided to share the talk I gave at the Spirit and Place event on Saturday. When Christy Tidwell from the Senior Academy at IUPUI first came to my office to share the idea of the Spirit and Place event, she said something that I have quoted often since. She said, "Quakers are kind of on the cutting edge of silence." I had never heard anyone put it that way, but I guess it's true. At least that's been my experience. A few years ago, I began describing myself as a spiritual mutt. I was born a Hoosier and a Lutheran outside of Fort Wayne, Indiana. And since then, I've been on an adventurous spiritual journey. I've served Lutheran churches, a Mennonite church, and was even ordained and served as an Anglican priest. But in 2008, I began a doctoral program at a Quaker university on the West Coast that changed everything for me. To my knowledge, up until this time, I had only met one Quaker, and that was Richard Foster, who wrote the classic book, Celebration of Discipline. At the time, I was studying to be an Anglican priest and attended a Renovare conference where, after being introduced to Richard Foster, remember, a Quaker, he asked if my wife and I would help serve communion with elements. Looking back, that was an odd experience since Quakers do not observe rituals like communion with the elements of bread and wine. Well, more on that in a minute. Back in 2008, my doctoral program with George Fox University met on Cannon Beach in Oregon. Each morning for our 2-week intensive, I would get up early, take a walk on the beach, stop for a cup of coffee, and then head to the small chapel on the campus of Ecola Bible College. The first time attending this intensive was not only my first time in Oregon, it would also be my introduction to Quaker silent worship. That first morning, I awoke to a thick fog and was startled by the bugle calls of a herd of elk heading to the beach, crossing my path on my way to get coffee. I was in another world altogether, and this was not Indiana. There was a long line at the coffee shop, so I was running late when I entered the small chapel. And as I opened the door, I stopped in my tracks because I found my cohort circled up and sitting in silence. I immediately assumed they were beginning to pray, so I stopped and stood at the door waiting for the silence to break. The silence would not break for almost 25 more minutes. I stood there a long time, uncomfortable, wondering what was going on. Did something happen? Were we waiting for our leader? Did I miss something? Well, after standing at the door for several minutes, I decided to silence my phone and capture the moment by taking a photo of this scene. I still have the photo of this moment, which I keep in my office to remind me of this monumental experience in my spiritual life. As I continued to stand in the door of that chapel, I soon realized I was going through a deep transformation. The quiet of this sacred space was becoming a gateway for me to finding something I was deeply missing in my crazy busy life and my spiritual journey. For the first time in a long time, I could hear my breath and even my heartbeat. I stopped rushing, even put down my coffee, and slipped into the chair in the circle. No one moved or even acknowledged me. I began to wrestle in my soul with the silence and realized my jet lag made it harder to keep my body and mind awake. In just 5 minutes, my mind had been all over the place from wondering what the rest of the day would be like, who were the people in the circle, and moments of dozing off. I often opened my eyes to look around to see if anyone else was struggling. Just as I began to sense a centering experience with the silence, the facilitator, who would become my spiritual director for my entire doctoral program, finally broke the silence by reading a poem. This continued to be a completely new worship experience for me. At this point, people began to share out of the silence their experiences, what spoke to them in the poem, even words which the divine had put on their heart as they waited expectantly in silence. Soon, I was welcomed by our facilitator and told, "It will get easier as you experience sitting in the silence every day over the next 2 weeks." In our world today, he said, silence must be a discipline that you practice. Don't worry, it will come over time. How did he know what I was experiencing? I started to realize I might have been showing a little of my lack of comfort and experience with the silence. Richard Foster explained this well when he wrote in the Celebration of Disciplines, "One reason we can hardly bear to remain silent is that it makes us feel so helpless. We are so accustomed to relying upon words to manage and control others. If we are silent, who will take control? God will take control, but we will never let him take control until we trust him. Silence is intimately related to trust." So let me return to communion. As I said earlier, Quakers do not celebrate the Lord's Supper or communion with elements like bread and wine. Rather, they commune with the divine through silence. It becomes the gateway, the sacrament, the opening to the divine. Quaker Rufus Jones explains it this way. The early Quakers, friends, made the discovery that silence is one of the best preparations for communion with God and for the reception of inspiration and guidance. Silence itself, of course, has no magic. It may be just sheer emptiness, absence of words or noise or music. It may be a dead form, but it may be an intensified pause, a vitalized hush, a creative quiet, an actual moment of mutual and reciprocal correspondence with God. Take, for instance, when we have our first snowfall of the year that covers the ground with a white blanket. I love to run outside and simply experience the silence it produces. Or last week when the fog was so thick, I love to drive through it with my windows down and the radio in my car off because it produces a special silence that our noisy world does not offer us anymore. Just before I discovered Quaker silence in that chapel in Oregon, I heard of a man named Matt Mickelson on NPR who was traveling the West Coast looking for the quietest places in the United States. He works for a nonprofit called Square Inch of Silence that promotes the preservation of quiet places, those without human-made sounds. He says there are only about 10 such places in the United States left, one being in the rainforests of the Olympic National Forest in Washington. I had the privilege before moving my family back to Indiana to go to this rainforest and experience the silence. It is breathtaking. Yet, Matt's research has found that noise has negatively affected the ecosystem, just as noise negatively affects our social and emotional systems. He points out that the world needs silence to thrive and to live to its full potential. And the more we recognize this, the more it changes our lives. Thus, like snow or fog or the depths of a rainforest, I believe the same can happen gathered in a circle in a chapel or meeting house for worship. Ever since my first experience in 2008 with silent worship, I've come to not only appreciate, but long for it in my life. Let's be honest, since 2008, our world has been through a lot. Whether it was a recession, a pandemic, 4 years of insane politics, racial upheavals, wars, you name it. I and many others have been seeking a place to reconnect with something greater than us, something that can make sense of the world, something that can bring peace and clarity and a sense of community again. And I believe silence, or as we're saying, quiet, is the gateway. At First Friends, we've seen extensive growth coming out of the pandemic and the tumultuous political season of the last several years. When talking with our new attenders, the one thing that is always a huge attractor is our emphasis on silence, whether in our unprogrammed or programmed worship. For those not familiar with those terms, unprogrammed worship is simply sitting in silence for about an hour and waiting expectantly for the divine to speak in the midst. Some may be moved by the Spirit to give vocal ministry or speak out of the silence. As for programmed worship, we include music and choirs and prayers and scriptures and a sermon. But we always have a significant amount of silence, or what we call waiting worship as well. Like me, our new attenders may not know when they first attend worship that they needed silence in their lives. Yet over time, they come to value it and choose to find ways to incorporate it into their daily lives. Richard Foster's son, Nathan, said this so well in his book, The Making of an Ordinary Saint, My Journey from Frustration to Joy with the Spiritual Disciplines. He says this, "Today, silence is one of the most essential disciplines of the Spirit simply because it puts a stopper on all the mindless chatter and clatter. It enables us to step aside from the noise and hurry and crowds of modern life long enough to allow God to create in us attitudes and habits that will hold us constantly in the loving presence of God." There was a time not so very long ago when solitude and silence were available to people by the normal conditions of everyday life. Not any longer. In our day, we have to choose solitude and silence and plan our lives accordingly. It can be done, of course, especially as we catch a vision of their liberating qualities. Thomas Merton wrote, "It is in deep solitude that I find the gentleness with which I can truly love others. Solitude and silence teach me to love others for what they are, not for what they say." Just maybe quiet or silence can be the gateway for those of us struggling in our world today. Just maybe, as we center down and enter a time or place of silence, we will begin to connect, as Quakers say, to that of God in every person around us. Just a few weeks ago, in one of our new attender dinners, I heard one of the best descriptions of waiting worship among friends. The person said something to the effect that during waiting worship, she senses that even with all the diversity of people and thought in our meeting, at some point during silent worship, she imagines all of our hearts unite and begin to beat in rhythm together. Wow, that has stuck with me because so much is happening in the silence, and often it is our words that get in the way. We need to let the silence be the gateway, again, to greater moments with the divine and with each other. So this morning, as I do every Sunday at the close of my sermon here at First Friends, I would like us to enter a time of what we label waiting worship. To help us center down in a Quaker tradition, I'm providing a couple queries for you to ponder in this brief silence. The queries are from a book I highly recommend, Holy Silence, by fellow Quaker and Hoosier J. Brent Bill. How could taking time for silence enlarge my day? And which takes a bigger place in my life, silence or noise? And which of the two do I feel more comfortable with?
We close this time of worship with a Quaker prayer. God, open our eyes and unstop our ears, that we may see your light and may hear your heartbeat, reflecting and resounding within our chests, in those of all our neighbors, near and far, in all creatures and plants, and in the ground we walk upon. When we finally are able to yield to the leading of your rhythm and flow, may we come to walk cheerfully over the world, answering that of you in all. Amen. Have a great week, friends.